All right. I think it's about time for us to get started here with this webinar on the state of API security. Howard, are you with me here as well?
Sure am. I
There we
sure am.
are. We both made it. That's good. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the webinar on the state of API security, and I am Tim Erlin, head of product at Wallarm. I'm joined today by Howard Holton, who's the CTO at GigaOM. Before we dive in, I'll just do a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, we are doing this webinar both on Zoom and broadcast on LinkedIn. If you have questions during the webinar, you can put them in the Q&A on Zoom or in the chat on LinkedIn, and we'll do our best to capture those at the end or in the middle if we can, and answer them along the way. Feel free to do that. The webinar is also being recorded. Since it's broadcast on LinkedIn, it's always available there for you to rewatch or share with someone who didn't see it and you think might be interested. I think those are all the housekeeping items I have. So, Howard, first of all, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate the time and effort. I was particularly excited about this webinar after we did our preparation. I think it's an interesting and timely topic.
I tend to agree with you. I think when it comes to security, there's very little today that I think is more important than API security. Not because it's the top attack vector necessarily, but really we've done a really good job of kind of having something in place for the other attack vectors, and API security seems to be kind of an open door.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, this is where we want to start with, the threat landscape and that question of why is this a topic now? API security, as you point out, is just one of many, topics in cybersecurity, but and it may not be at the top of the list in terms of attack vectors, but it's certainly one that's growing. And I'm going to put up some slides as we go through here. This is mostly a conversation between Howard and I. We may talk about the content of the slides, but mostly they're there for folks to look at as well. What I have up now is our dynamic list of API security threats, top 10 list that we produce in our API threat stats report. So it just gives you an idea of some of the vectors that we're seeing in the analysis that we do. But Howard, you mentioned a little bit about why API security is a hot topic now, but what makes it particularly relevant? Why do you think this is a topic that CISOs need to be talking about today?
Well, for a few reasons. So the first is the attackers are running businesses just like we are. Like that's kind of a fundamental thing to understand. The myth of a kid in their basement being the attacker you're protecting yourself from is in fact a myth. Right? It's not that they don't exist, but that's not really who we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about organized gangs running businesses to compromise organizations, right? And so they're doing, you know, risk benefit analysis, right? They're doing cost benefit analysis. They're doing, all the things that we do as a business to determine whether something's worth or not. And APIs have kind of two big challenges with them. The first is they're an attack vector like everything else that's an attack vector. The less protected they are, the easier they are to compromise, the easier they are to use as an injection point, as an entry point, as a pivot point, et cetera, et cetera. However, the bigger issue in my mind is um, unlike a lot of other things, like let's use a VPN appliance as an example, entry point. There's no data on a VPN appliance that's really going to compromise my organization. So let's say you've hardened the security and you're no longer injection and authentication flaws. Cool, you've dealt with that. But you also have the data leakage issue because that's what APIs do is provide data exchange.
Yeah.
Right?
And this
In
is,
some
I mean,
cases, really valuable data exchange, right?
absolutely. And I think that it's interesting, you've touched on at least three of the top four items on the dynamic, top 10 list that we have here. Injections are an interesting one because in terms of threat, they fall at the top of the list of what we see in actual attacks. The OWASP API top 10, if folks are familiar with that, has moved injections down into number 10 and buried it underneath a different, it's like, inappropriate consumption of APIs, something like that. But API leaks is the most interesting on here. And because you can see over time it's steadily increased throughout 2023 in terms of an attack vector. Um, and it's not just the data that the API itself leaks, but it's also the availability of sensitive information in like third-party tools that are being used to manage APIs.
Oh,
So,
100%.
GitHub's a great example, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, let's not talk about secrets management. This could go into a deep dark place, right? But yeah, I mean, without a doubt, the challenge that we have, kind of how we got here, basically. I say this all the time. I pay developers to be fast. I pay security to be slow. Too often, development wins. I have to ship my product by a certain date. I have a schedule I have to keep. I've got to get enhancements and improvements in the hand of my application users, right? APIs are a great tool to enable additional speed in my development process. I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I just find someone else's wheel and use that. A wheel provided by someone else would be a better way to put it, and use that. The
Mm-hmm.
challenge is, like with any library, you get the entire library, even if you only need 1 or 2 pages, right? And because we're focused on speed within development, we're not then following that up with security and giving security the proper time to add the right amount of friction to ensure that we're not increasing risk.
Yeah. There are two things in there that I think are fascinating that I'd love to dig into. We'll see if we can do both of them. So one is this uh the the growth in the number of APIs that are available because API development provides speed and APIs provide integration, which um, faster integration for the business, not the developers, but for the business means faster delivery of services. So at this point, you're now talking about a threat landscape that isn't just things I've built, but also things other people have built that I've chosen to integrate with because they were useful or because I was, they gave me a significant improvement in terms of delivery speed, right?
For sure. And I may not control the totality of the path either. There are a ton of APIs that provide data and integration into my business systems that I subscribe to, which means I don't
Right.
have full control over those, right? So,
Exactly.
20 years ago, the way we did that moved kind of that data around, like that primary data interface was OBDC,
Oh yeah,
right?
of course.
And APIs in many ways have replaced that, but not done so in a way where we control all of the security landscape the way we likely did with our database connections,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
yet we haven't really changed how we look at those things. It's just we moved from this to this,
Hmm.
and didn't realize that the risk landscape changed by a factor of 10, in some cases a factor of 100.
Yeah. 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 So we've dramatically expanded that threat landscape. We've opened ourselves up to more types of attacks that are targeting APIs. That increase in the number of APIs. I'm always fond of saying that the attackers they follow the opportunity, which is just a different way of what you said at the beginning. So if we're developing and deploying more APIs, attackers are going to spend more of their time targeting those APIs. That's where the benefit is. Um, so I think it's worthwhile. It's always all well and good for you and I to talk at this sort of theoretical level or conceptual level of what that attack surface looks like. But I think it's always useful to have a few examples of real world attacks or real world incidents that have occurred. And I put a couple in the slides for us to talk about. Um, this first one, we mentioned leaks as a starting point. This first one is a one that occurred or was published a couple of weeks ago, I think, where there was an API token that was exposed, on a public GitHub repository that provided access to a private GitHub repository for Mercedes-Benz and ultimately to source code. So that's an example of, the expansion of that attack surface beyond your own infrastructure or the infrastructure that you control.
Yeah, for sure, right? Here we're looking at like there's two sides to an API attack, right? The first side is effectively malicious, the second side is effectively malformed, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think it's important that we kind of mention that, right? So malicious is what we tend to see in many of these cases, right? Someone made a mistake, left a back door open, or wasn't looking for a particular like injection, That's a really good example.
Yeah.
And the API responded in an unexpected way or gave access in an unexpected way. The second, right, due to a malicious piece of code generally. The second is malformed, where the API operated exactly as expected. However, someone used a valid API query and got back results that were unexpected, right? And unintended. The developer never intended for all of that information to go out, but the API had it available to it, and they had no way to watch for it and prevent it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so we do need to keep in mind when we're looking at these things, we're generally talking about one or two of those giant buckets,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
To be protected against.
I think that's an incredibly useful way to think about API attacks, malformed versus malintentioned, because we do tend to pay more attention to the malformed examples because they're frankly they're easier to detect than
1,000 times.
malintentioned, right?
Yeah, 1,000 times.
And if I
Right.
look at the incidents on this slide, we've got that token leak, we've got another token example where Cloudflare was compromised with an Okta token that was breached in a completely separate incident. Interestingly, this is a nation state example. You pointed out that we're not talking about kids in the script kiddies in the basement anymore. That's a great example of that. And then this 23andMe example where sort of a classic credential stuffing use case, stolen credentials in one incident used to authenticate to 23andMe. But then the real impact there was that they had a feature in their platform that allowed you to get information about other users, this DNA relatives feature. And that's an example of the malintentioned piece of it, right? The API worked perfectly, did exactly what it was supposed to do, but the intent of the person using it was, malicious.
Well, yes. And also potentially unintended. No one ever intended for that feature to be used exactly that way, and yet
Mhm.
it still had all that data available to it and just dumped, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want to say GSA had a similar attack several years ago, which kind of initially sparked a bunch of this conversation, where a vendor portal was used to scrape all of the data contained within that particular system in a way that it was supposed to report on you and give you information about you and the bids that you had in, and instead it revealed every bid, every opportunity, and everyone that had ever replied, kind of drop of data.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great example as well. There was also a Duolingo example of a public API that did exactly what it's supposed to recently. I didn't put it in the slides. Interestingly, I didn't organize these around this categorization of malformed versus malintentioned, but it turned out that way because I think these three examples are actually malformed. So we have the move it breach, which was a SQL injection. We've got one, I'll say one of the Avanti issues because there have been a bunch of them, which was server-side request forgery. That's an example where, you can trick basically an API into requesting an internal resource. And then there was recently a series of API defects in Cisco Unified Comms gateways that were sort of authentication bypass, uh, you know, uh, attacks, vulnerabilities. So a great example actually of that split. Three examples where they were malintentioned but well formed, and three examples where they were malformed, and it just happened to break down that way.
No, that's great. That's great. And to your point, right? The malformed are sorry, yeah, the malformed are often easier to find, right? Like
Yeah,
if you look at the first example, um the one of the challenge with injection attacks is they look like SQL injection attacks. Like when you look at what's happening, it looks just like what we saw in SQL, right? And for
right.
those that remember, I almost wish I had the Johnny Tables example from the comic.
Hmm.
I don't know if you remember that one, but we need to talk about your son's name. Oh, you
Yes,
mean
Johnny Tables.
Johnny
Yes,
Tables, right?
yes, yes.
Like we've known about these for 15 years, and yet we deployed APIs without looking back to the past and saying, "Hey, maybe we should protect it against the stuff that we're already aware of."
You're absolutely right, and they're basically any any web application or API security tool should really be able to detect SQL injection. Like it's a pretty straightforward detection mechanism at this point. But having said that, we still see a huge impact from something like Move It, where you have a commercial product that was deployed that was subject to SQL injection, impacted a whole bunch of different organizations. And that's why we still see injections at the top of the list in terms of attack traffic. It's still a
Sure.
significant problem, even though it's easy to detect, of course.
But it also is really easy to do.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
again, if we go back to the businesses, what's the first thing I'm going to try?
Low
Well, I'm going
cost.
to try the easiest thing, the lowest cost, the most automated thing I can possibly try. And if it works,
Yeah,
I don't need to try something else, right?
yeah,
Remember, an attacker is looking for one chink in the armor. A defender must protect against all of them,
that's right. Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So that's where where some of the challenge and frankly, like frustration, right, comes from is you have to make it too expensive.
Yeah,
We're not looking to make it impossible. We're looking to make it too
too
expensive.
expensive. Yeah,
Is
yeah,
your house more expensive to break in? Does it take longer and require more effort than three doors down?
yeah.
Right? Not is it perfect?
Yeah. So I think we've covered the threat landscape fairly well. There are a couple of questions that have come across. I think I'll insert them here before we move on to a slightly different topic. The first question was any good source where we can find guidelines for API threats. I did mention the OWASP API top 10. And of course, I have to mention the Wallarm API threat stats report. Howard, anything you would add to that list?
I would pay attention to what CISA and the NSA are talking about. Um, this is a huge topic for them. Matter of fact, Black Hat 2 years ago, I think, might have been three, right? It's hard. It's always hard to tell going through COVID, like what happened there. It always feels
Hmm.
like 1 week and one
Yeah,
decade.
yeah,
But their keynote was the NSA head of cybersecurity talking specifically about API attacks.
yeah,
So they're really focused on this as both an attack vector and a danger spot because, well, we all kind of shifted this way and so much data is contained there. So for all
yeah.
the reasons we talked about. So those are places that I would pay attention to as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned CISA, they have their known exploited vulnerabilities list, the KEV list. A huge, I'm trying to remember the specific percentage. It's in our threat stats report, but I think it's better than 50% of those are actually API related vulnerabilities at this point. That changes over time, of course, but it's significant.
Yeah, it's huge. I would say like pick a source that delivers information in a way that's easy for you to consume, comfortable for you to consume, and then just follow that source. Like there's so much information. While you may miss one week to week, there's so much to do. I wouldn't be so concerned about you know what I mean, you're not gonna sit around and go, well, if I'd have known about this last week, I would have had time to fix it.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
there's so much coming at you that I would really find something that's easy to consume. Otherwise, it just starts to become noise, and you really want to avoid the noise.
yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. So we've talked about the threat landscape. I think we've covered that fairly well. Let's talk a little bit about the best practices. And so I pulled up, the GigaOM API Security Radar primarily because of the key criteria comparison, which those key criteria, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they give an overview of what you might consider in terms of core requirements as for an API security solution. Is that right, Howard?
So yeah, so there's two different kind of sections. The first is table stakes. And table stakes is basically in order to even be considered for the report, much less be featured in the report, you have to do these things, right? The challenge with table stakes is if all you do is table stakes, I don't recommend buying your platform at all because you're behind the market.
Hmm.
Key criteria are these are the things that are important today and being more and becoming more important tomorrow. And so these are really the things you should focus on and really where you should spend your time as a buyer as a company looking to protect your organization. So the key criteria are what it says on the package, right? They are the key criteria that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Are there in those key criteria, do you prioritize them or do you feel like there's a set of priorities there that people should consider?
No. Well, yes and no. The challenge with prioritizing them is every organization is different. Every organization's maturity is different. The way these things can benefit an organization is a little bit different depending on is this a security tool? Is this an IT
Hmm.
tool because security is not clearly broken out? Is this a software development tool? You know what I mean? Like, do you have a security center of innovation where this might go? Right? Or center of
Hmm.
excellence where this might go because it does touch so many different pieces. And so it really is, it's more valuable for you as an organization to look at it and say, well, within these key criteria, these are the two that I care about the most, regardless of what GigaOM thinks. So we
Yeah.
don't break them out or grade them on a curve. It is the same scoring
Yeah.
value for each one.
So if we think about, I tend to use the terms sort of, the maturity, a maturity scale, but I hate to call an organization immature because I think, organizations are just at different stages. But if we use that kind of a scale, an organization just starting out with API security, what's going to be most important for them in terms of key criteria to accomplish? And then at the other end of the spectrum, what do we see mature organizations doing around API security?
Sure. So I would say if you're maturity, like if you're trying to get into maturity 1 to 2, which is a huge scale, right? Monitoring, reporting, and static scanning are pretty high on the list because the number one thing I recommend everyone do is really understand your API estate, right? There's been some research done, and it is estimated that companies underestimate the number of APIs they have running in their environment by
Hmm.
50% to 400%, right? Which means if I say I have 100, I have between 150 and 400 APIs actually running. And before you start disconnecting from the webinar now, I want you to think about the APIs that are still running on pieces of equipment that you bought that the vendor has deprecated but not turned off.
Yeah.
Right? I want you to
Yeah.
think about the APIs that you've welcomed into your environment that you don't use. We're not talking about just the ones that you've added to your applications, but that exist across the entire estate. And then also consider, do you have any shadow IT running? Right? If you can honestly say no to that, then great. I will happily give you the gold star and say you know of 100%. But the reality is most of us have shadow IT running, even if we're not aware of what that shadow IT is. Contained within that is likely APIs, right? So static scanning methods, monitoring and reporting, great places to start. They're kind of the low-hanging fruit, and you're going to get a ton of value from being able to wrap your arms around what that estate looks like. As you
Yeah.
continue to evolve, right, I would say abuse detection and prevention and runtime protections become really, really important. And then the top and bottom, right? Ingestion methods and covered API types and advanced analytics and AI.
Yeah.
Um, and as your maturity improves, advanced analytics and AI is going to provide so much value. Today, it's up to you whether you trust it or not. Tomorrow, every single day, our trust in these things is going to improve. And it will get to the point where those are critical features.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think for folks who've been in cybersecurity, information security for a long time, there's a pattern here that holds true with any evolving threat or any new threat, which is, it starts with your protection has to start with some kind of inventory or discovery because you always start from the position of, oh my gosh, there's a threat and I don't know how exposed I am. So whether it's assets or it's it's servers or cloud assets or APIs or web apps, it always starts with that inventory piece and then moves on to block bad things, and then takes a step from there to reducing risk proactively in some way. And there are probably a couple of steps in that stage, but API security is no different in this case. You have to start with, as you say, understanding what that estate looks like so that you can ultimately protect it, and then move on to reducing risk in that environment.
100%. The only thing I would say is if you're an organization that rolls your own software as kind of your default, right? Then I would say rather than prevent, it would be reduce risk. I would switch the order of those two things, right?
Yeah,
If I've got a large number of software developers, I want to get feedback to them as quickly as possible and start changing our design patterns so that we start considering this more, really more of that kind of DevSecOps. And so my priorities might shift a little bit,
yeah.
right? Versus someone
And
that rolls very little of their own software, that may not be as high a priority, right? It may be easier to simply prevent, um, as a matter of policy and procedure.
well, and the move to, sort of shift left, the movement of DevSecOps to, sort of integrate security and development that's not new. That's been around for a long time. Well, I'd say a long time at this point. Um, but the evidence suggests that it hasn't been very effective given the threat landscape that we just talked about.
Yeah,
So, do we think that that effort is ultimately unsuccessful, or do we think that it's part of a larger effort, or do we think that it just hasn't had time?
I'm going to say yes to all three. The challenge goes back to what I said early on, which is I pay developers to be fast, I pay security to be slow.
Yeah,
In order to properly do DevSecOps, I have to pay developers to be not quite as fast,
yeah,
and no one's
yeah,
really
yeah.
prepared to do that, right?
There's
And how do you take developers?
yeah.
You get 10, 20, 30 years experience in the industry doing things in a really specific mindset focused around how quickly can I get this done? Because I have far more to do than could possibly be done. How do I do it with the least number of code errors that are going to cause errors and issues? Now I have to add security on top of that as part of my day-to-day responsibility. And that's a mindset shift that no one prepared anyone for, right?
Mm,
And then we also didn't change security to say, hey, look, while your job is to be the no plow, right? While your job is to say no frequently, your job is to say no but. And too many forget the but, right? Yes, and no but.
yeah.
You can't just say no and stop the process. You have to
No.
say, these are the things we need to do to move this forward, not these are the things you need to do because I'm now stopping it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. There's a certain amount of both irony and poetry that we ended up with the term DevSecOps, where sec is literally inserted between dev and ops in the term itself. I hadn't
It's
I
the
hadn't
right
really
place
thought
for it.
about that, but yeah, it's the right place
It's
in that sense.
the right
Yeah.
place, right? You develop, then you secure, then you can operationalize.
Yeah.
You certainly couldn't secure before you develop, right? What most companies tend to do though is dev, ops, meh, sec,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
They develop, they put it in operations, and then they go, oh crap, we forgot about security. Now we have to go back and fix it.
Yes.
Fix it in
There's
post,
a long
right?
history of that. Absolutely. And to be fair, if it's not that adding layers of security after development, after deployment is a bad thing. It's just that it doesn't solve the problem of reducing risk, being deployed in the first place.
I mean, look, I can think of a relatively recent incident where some people would have loved to have mechanics on the plane fixing it while it was in flight. However, it's better to secure the screws that hold the door on while it's on the ground and not moving,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things we can do while things are in motion. Like there's a reason the US Navy has a tremendous number of mechanics to fix ships in motion.
Yeah.
However, it's always better to do it in dry dock. That didn't seem intended.
It
So
was not. Well,
speaking
there
of
we go.
malintentioned,
We do have just a couple of questions that have popped in, so I'll present them here. One question. This is about actually back to the API leaks topic. Someone asked, they found while scanning a public GitHub repository an API token. How can we define the identified token belongs to our organization? Interesting question. And how can we remove the identified token if the repo belongs to a third person? Also an interesting question.
um, I would say you can trace down who owns the repo and try to contact them, like
Yeah.
open a ticket. Right, that'd be the very first thing that I would do. That'd be minute one, second one. Like, hey, do you know you have an exposed API token here? You need to fix this. You need to fix this right away.
And that's relevant regardless of whether you've confirmed that that token belongs to your organization or not. Chances are they don't intend to expose that API token.
Correct. Correct. That's why that's step one. Plus, that step can be done in 30 seconds, a minute.
Yeah. Well,
Right. You found it. You can immediately take that action. Now, the next piece is you are going to have to determine whether that is an API owned by you or not. And generally, you're going to find that contained within the source code around the same kind of position. Right. And so I would start looking for that as well and say, hey,
yeah.
does this look like ours? Is this ours? Is there some action we need to take?
There's another option there. If you have the tooling in place to look for that token in traffic, you could potentially block its use as well, but you may not want to do that until you know what it's used for, because you might find that something suddenly doesn't work that you need working. But searching for that token in traffic, if you're tooled for that, you can certainly do that as well and find out if it's being used in your organization.
Yeah, it may also be something you can add as a custom rule. So when you see it, it creates an
Exactly.
alert and look for investigation. One of the things I would look for there is like geologging, right? Has the geography changed in where this API is coming from, or the use of this API is coming from? Things like that are a good kind of way to start. So that's probably a good idea to do as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Yeah,
But it,
absolutely.
it it really depends on your tooling that's going to define what your capabilities are.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. I don't see any additional questions right now. So, um, okay. So I think well, let's move on to this conversation, which I think of as sort of a a bookmark to uh, that best practices, maturity level conversation, because there's kind of an internal view and then there's an external view. So when we talk about API security and the market itself, um, what do we? This is a picture that I drew, right? You've got API security, you've got tools like API management. There's some overlap with some observability. There's bot management. There's web application firewall, or if you like Gartner's term, web application and API protection. Um, how how do you see the API security tools being viewed by CISOs and specifically with regard to budget? Like what budget are people allocating to purchase tools for API security today?
So that's part of the challenge within the security space in general, especially as we bleed into other areas, right? Because kind of to your point, like WAF, right? WAF and API security, there's a big piece of API security contained within WAF. WAF is arguably more an infrastructure spent, right? That's
Yeah.
a totally different budget, right? And part of the conversation that I think every organization needs to have when they're looking at these things is who owns the budget for this? Who owns the risk and responsibility for this? And how are we going to pay for it? And within that context, if we did something like WAF, right, which Wallarm did really well in our WAF report as well, right? Are we better off to do that and then leverage the budget from the CIO, or is that budget not available for us, right? I've been a CISO multiple times, and oftentimes going to my board and saying, "Hey, we have this security challenge. Here's what's happened in the news. Here's how we solve it, and we solve it with a dedicated security solution," is a way to free up budget that didn't exist when
Hmm.
my budget was figured out for the year, right?
Yeah.
If I go in and say, "Hey, here's this thing that's going to benefit IT and security," the budget doesn't necessarily exist, right? And so some of it really is like, what does the conversation look like within your organization? And
Well,
how successful can you be
mhm.
within that conversation, right? API management, API security, observability, bot management, like all of these things, they have different, if you were to layer in kind of the 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 chart that showed um, who owns the budget for each of these and where the budget kind of overlap is, you'd have a whole nother layer of a chart that might allow you to answer that question a little differently or clearer maybe.
And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's really easy for people to get um, sort of myopic about the way their own organization works, and think that everybody else is in the same situation. But I think you have a viewpoint of lots of different organizations, and so you can provide some context for who is responsible for who you see being responsible in different organizations for API security, and does it include just the applications that they're building themselves, or also all of those APIs that they've purchased and deployed or have pulled in, from partners, that kind of thing?
Or unwittingly received as part of a application purchase.
Well, there's that too. Yeah.
Remember, your ISVs are also providing an application to you that likely has APIs within it, right? It's why for a little bit, API security and software supply chain became somewhat synonymous. Like it was really weird to see API security growing in as a term, and then you had software supply chain growing as a term, which kind of meant the same thing. And then everybody went, well, no, we don't like software supply chain. Now we're back to API security, but we're still keeping software supply chain. Like the overlap in those two things is huge. And I think part of the challenge there was API security, right? Your development team goes, well, I'm not responsible for the APIs. That sounds like security and infrastructure. Software supply chain infrastructure goes, that's a not a me problem.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
that's a procurement problem, right? I mean,
it
yeah,
but it
supply
can
chain
be,
security is
right?
a messy term at best because it includes things
Correct.
like APIs you're consuming, but it also includes things like the suppliers of, the chips in the devices that you're using. Like
It can.
it's a
That's
blurry
part of the
line at
problem.
best.
That's part of the problem, right? Is it's such a big topic, but it does include things like API security. It includes the third-party libraries that you have wittingly and unwittingly received from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Log4j is kind of the leading,
Yeah. It's the
the leading kind of
quintessential example. Yeah.
commentary on software supply chain. But you have to then say, I don't develop all my APIs myself. I likely subscribe to or adopt other APIs. That question that came in over Zoom is a perfect example, right?
Yeah.
That's an API being used by a third party, which
Yeah.
means that third party, that's part of their supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it does make it a bit of a sticky wicket piece of conversation, right? And
Yeah.
we're
It
now
does.
back to it's going to apply to your organization and your organization specifically on who owns it. In a large financial organization, I would expect that to be owned by the CISO, and the CISO has enough budget and budgetary control that they're able to address that.
Yeah.
Um, I would say in most cases, I'd like to see it owned by the CISO because the if it's owned by either the CIO or the CTO, then they're going to have a development push on it or an infrastructure push on it, and likely one or the other is going to be left kind of out in the rain.
Mhm. Do you see? I mean, one of the areas is closely aligned with API security is API management. I say aligned intentionally because I don't think they overlap significantly. Do you see people being confused about API management, API gateways, and API security, or do you feel like that distinction is fairly clear for folks?
Um, I think there is some kind of confusion initially. And frankly, vendors don't help a whole ton, right? You want to solve as many of your customers' problems as you
Of
can,
course. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so API management companies are adding security tools, but that doesn't mean that they are API security. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Well,
so
and
we
what
really
we've seen is they're generally focused on, you know, authentication,
correct,
authorization, like
correct,
consolidating those functions, which to be fair are security functions, but they're very different from detecting and blocking SQL injections as an example.
correct, correct. And that's a piece of the challenge that you really as a buyer have to look at, right? When you say security, what do you mean,
Yeah.
right?
And,
Um, and,
and
and are you willing to
that's
indemnify me against API risks?
yeah.
You know what I mean? Because you're going to have some companies that are going to come back and say, we secure your API completely. Great. So that means you can indemnify me. You can write a legal document indemnifying me against API security risk, in which case that risk becomes your risk. And they're going to go, no, 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 no. Cool. Let's have another conversation about what you mean by security,
Yeah. That
right?
so there's a functional aspect there, which is, what we're talking about. Are we talking about, authorization? Or are we talking about blocking attacks? Are we talking about API discovery? So you can't just check the box on API security. You actually have to understand what you're purchasing or implementing. But there's also, I think, and I'm curious for your viewpoint on it, mm, sort of logical location conversation there. So when I look at WAF as an example, WAF has traditionally been a very perimeter focused technology, right? You deploy it, at ingress to prevent bad things from the outside from getting in. But APIs are not exclusively an ingress technology. They're deployed all over the place. And there's also, not just the north-south, but also the east-west kind of traffic. And so there's this distinction in terms of how you choose to deploy those as well. And that has an ownership aspect, I think, or an ownership attribute that's a little bit different sometimes.
No, no, it absolutely does, right? Again, right, WAF, we're talking about a piece of infrastructure that enables work to be done, right? That means that at very minimum has co-ownership between security and infrastructure,
Yep. Yep.
right? Or security and IT operations would be a better way to put it, right? API security, due to the east-west nature, it's very, very, very important that you're able to secure the traffic that is wholly within your organization, in addition to the north-south traffic,
Hmm.
right? Because I mean, statistically, right, when we're looking at a penetration that gets discovered, it's 9 months, right? I mean, if you look at the
Yeah.
example,
Of
the
dwell
first
time,
example
right?
was
Persistence. Yeah.
correct, dwell time, right? Which means someone's sitting in your network for 9 months on average, right? The GitHub example is a pretty popular example, and that was September to January, right?
Yeah.
So if they're
Yeah.
sitting in your network for 9 months, all that east-west traffic is open to them. And if all you're doing is watching the perimeter, you're no longer seeing them go after your API. And that's a really valuable piece of information that you need to be on top of.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting to think about that in terms of the distinction between malformed and malintentioned, because what may start with a malintentioned attack, a vector could turn into simply malformed, or sorry, which may start with a malformed thing that you could have detected, can turn it into simply malintention traffic internal that you may not see because it looks like normal requests.
For sure.
Interesting.
For sure. And one of the neat things to look at, neat, please, I'm not supporting these things. I just find it interesting to go through the forensic log. When
Yeah.
you start looking at the forensics of a cyber attack, right, especially ransomware is the last thing done in the network,
Yes.
right? I'm going to
Yeah.
blow it up and get the heck out.
Yeah.
But what you get is not, I'll give you the key. It's I'll give you the key to unlock them, but also just so you know, I have all of this other data about your company.
Yeah.
I can release this to the dark web or not. It's up to you,
Yeah.
right? Ransom isn't just for keys to unlock the doors, but also to prevent your secrets. And those secrets can be PII, right? Those secrets don't have to necessarily be intellectual property, but can also be source code, can also be intellectual property,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that comes from them dwelling inside your network for some amount of time. So
Yeah.
you really need to think about this security as security that is complete and robust and takes a 360-degree view.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's step away from what things look like today and talk a little bit about things in the future. What do you see as sort of the emerging challenges in API security? What are the unsolved problems that people should be worried about?
I mean, malintentioned is really, really, really hard. It's really, really, really hard. Um, we're making huge progress in malformed,
Hmm.
huge, massive progress in malformed. And frankly, when we see one malformed attack to someone else, we can create a rule and apply that rule globally.
Yeah.
Malintentioned is so much more difficult because it has to much more to do with your particular organization, your particular data, right? And again, the job is to make sure that the data moves exactly as intended and never as not intended, and that provides a lot of gray area that you
Yeah.
really need to pay attention to. One of the things that I think is going to be interesting is the use of AI in really getting to a level of granularity that we simply don't have enough humans with enough eyeballs to be able to get to.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm
Yeah.
really interested in seeing how vendors are able to adopt AI to speed up some of the recognition and to really you're going to get a lot of noise. Like any new security tool that you put in is simply just more noise. And if I had the ability to do a poll, my poll would be, do you get too few alerts, just the right number of alerts, or too many alerts? And if anyone says just the right number of alerts or too few alerts, I would really have to question what their security estate looks like. Because
Because
every
they've turned all
single
the alerts off. Yeah.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
every single response I get is no, we're buried in alerts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm really curious to see how vendors are able to start using AI to really trim down on the number of alerts, right? To really promote signal over noise, and that's the big emerging thing that I'm looking to get out of this. The challenge is attackers are not getting dumber, and in as much as AI provides a benefit for us, it provides a benefit for them and they are agile organizations that move very very fast because they don't really care about breaking things, right?
Yeah.
They don't care about exposing themselves. They care about can I beat white hats to the end game.
Yeah. And AI as a tool is, I mean, it's just as useful to the attackers as it is to the defenders in terms of when we talk about malintention, we're really talking about, exploiting the logic of the application or the business logic of that application as opposed to a flaw in the software. And that's where AI has advantages, right? It can potentially understand what that application is intended to do, and then look for things um, that don't fit those intentions, and they could do that for defenders as well as attackers.
100%, 100%, right? And you cannot make a declaration that AI is not allowed in my organization, right? Like it is still a tool. It's a tool you need to be on top of. You may say, I'm not going to turn on the AI feature today. You may say, I don't trust the AI feature today. Those are all valid, but you can't bury your head in the sand because the opposition is not
Yeah,
burying
your
their.
your attackers are not going to have that policy.
Correct.
They're not going to follow your policy either.
Correct. Correct. I
Yeah.
I firmly believe that there are only two things every organization participates in, every person participates in, whether they want to or not. The first is you must participate in the currency market of wherever you're at. right? As in, the local currency, the US dollar, fluctuates on a day-to-day basis. I participate in that market. I have no choice. And I really can't influence the currency market. I'm kind of stuck with whatever's there. The only other one is security, right? I can't suddenly say I'm going to remove myself from the security landscape. I'm no
Hmm.
longer going to participate, and therefore I don't have to do this. The
Yeah.
fact is, attackers are there and they will take advantage of anything they can. You must participate. Not doing something is effectively posing no defense against an attacker.
Yeah. It is a particular kind of participation. Yeah.
It very much is.
Right.
And it's important for everyone listening to make sure that your organization understands these things. Right?
Yeah.
Make sure that they understand that you have no choice but to participate. And choosing not to participate is not choosing to not be attacked, it's choosing to not defend. That's the only choice you're making.
Right. Right. So we do want to talk a little bit about some practical advice for people. We've covered a lot of topics here. I think it's been interesting, but when people walk away from this webinar, what are sort of the three things that you recommend that they do? And in this case, we did prepare with this slide.
We did. We
It was
did
not
prepare this one
accidental.
because these were the three things that I was very specific to say, right?
Yes.
Collect,
Yeah.
interrogate, and document. Really catalog the APIs you have in your environment. This is pretty straightforward, right? Start with those that you're aware of and start with those that are the most critical,
I think
right?
that's a really important point because um, often people look at a challenge of like doing a discovery or doing inventory, and they're very concerned about capturing everything. The point that if you can define criticality to start with what's critical first is, I think, really useful and interesting.
So start with those things that are the most important to keeping your business moving and start with those things that you provide outside access to, right? And if you look at those as kind of two Venn diagrams, the most important are those where those two Venn diagram where there's two circles, right? The things that have external access and the things that keep the business moving have overlap,
Hmm.
right? Those are the we'll call those three buckets, right? The overlap and then the two individuals. Those are the three most important spots for your organization to concentrate on. That doesn't mean they're the only, but think of this as iteration, not perfection, right? Perfection is the enemy of progress. I want to identify those three buckets and then I want to interrogate them. I'm not asking you to look at what do you do with these APIs. I'm asking you to look at what capability do these APIs provide specifically that you are not using because the API is still going to provide that capability even if you're not using it, right? And so start documenting that. We use 3% of the capability of this API. We must guard against 100%.
That's interesting. So if you, for example, if you have a Swagger document or an API specification, comparing that to actual traffic is an interesting way to approach that because then you would see here are all the capabilities that are available and I can see the things that I'm actually using. And then there's a difference. Here are all the endpoints that we're not using that are still available.
Correct. Well, and then that also logically says, hey, since we're not using those, anytime those are attempted to be accessed, that's a valid alert,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And then document it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because now you've
That
done
would
that gap
capture
analysis.
malintentioned use of those endpoints. Yeah.
Correct. Correct. And it gives you an immediate place to start having a conversation about about maturity, right? About talking to vendors and going, hey, this is what I need to protect. Right now, I know this for sure. And remember, malintentions is the hardest one to protect against, right?
Yeah.
Malformed is fairly well understood. It doesn't mean it's perfect by any means. It's just better understood. And so now
Yeah.
you can start having really serious conversations with your vendors when they say, hey, we do API security. Great. These are the two things I need to do. So let's talk about malformed. How do you protect against those? Now let's talk about malintentioned because I've documented the specific intent I want to, at bare minimum, look for. How do you help me do that? Right.
Yeah.
And again, perfection's the enemy of progress. Don't kick everyone out because they don't do it yet. Right. But definitely, if somebody goes, ooh, we have no intentions to do that, it's probably a red flag.
Yeah.
Right. If we can't do that perfectly today, but this is what we suggest, that's a dialogue that sounds very partner centric. That sounds very customer centric, right? That sounds very much like we're entering into a bi-directional relationship where you're going to help me and we're going to grow together. You can't implement everything on day zero, and these products have not stopped development,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful. I think that's practical. It gives people something to walk away with. So I'm going to remind folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them into either the Q&A in Zoom or into the chat in LinkedIn, and we'll take a look at questions as they come in. Just to wrap up, a couple of things that are available for you if you want more information. Obviously, the GigaOhm radar is there. There's a URL, a QR code that you can grab. There's also our API threat stats report from Wallarm, which I mentioned, which includes a whole bunch of interesting data about API threats and vulnerabilities that occurred in the last year. So this is the annual report. So feel free to grab those. I do have one question that has shown up here. Shouldn't dev and sec occur concurrently? Um, I mean, I think that's a fair question. What do you think, Howard?
Dev, so it's chicken and egg, right? Dev occurs first, then sec, then dev, then sec, then dev, then sec, kind of thing,
Yeah, let's
right? And
remember that the image for DevSecOps is the infinity symbol, right? It
correct.
just keeps going.
Correct. But I mean, it is important to note you have to have something developed that you can secure. But once that happens, then yes, they run concurrently, right? There is no expectation that development will stop and security will begin, but rather development never I mean, in any application we're developing today, it really doesn't stop. I end a sprint, I start a new sprint. There is no real delineation between them other than my focus of this sprint was to accomplish a thing. My focus of this next sprint is to accomplish a different thing. And security needs to be aligned to that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's very hard to secure things while people are working on them. If you've ever tried to edit to be the copywriter on a document while the original author is in writing it, it does not work,
yes. That's a common problem these days with all the collaboration tools.
right?
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
I
It's
can't
true.
tell you the number of times I've been in editing something while someone else is in there, and I'm going, whoa, 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 I'm not done writing. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Messing with my flow. Get out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One other question that's shown up here: is there a tool that can report API dependencies to other APIs, like a tree view? I think that falls into that observability bubble that we talked about. So there are, application performance management observability tools that are more focused on documenting the interconnections between your components, your APIs, than securing them.
For sure. You might also look at service mesh, right? We're starting to see some of that integration into service meshes, which is a whole different topic.
Hmm.
Um, and that would be a good place to look for that as well, right? To see what's in your organization. You may have some capabilities there.
Yeah, great.
And there is a way to do that in API security, but it is not the most efficient way to do that in API security.
Yeah, good. So I'll end the webinar. I'll wrap up with a little promotion for our next webinar. We're doing another webinar in March 6th, around specifically account takeover attacks or incidents. I'll be joined by our field CTO, Tim Ebers, and me, Tim Erlin. So it's a Tim squared kind of event, and feel free to sign up for that. If for some reason you would like us to follow up with you, if you're on LinkedIn, feel free to comment on the LinkedIn thread. Just put API in the comment, and we'll follow up with you as well. Otherwise, Howard, I'd love to thank you for joining us. I think it was an interesting conversation, hopefully interesting for everyone other than us as well. So thanks
I
for
really
spending the
hope so.
time.
Yeah, it was good. I love talking about these topics because I don't think they get enough attention, right? And it is hard. We're as security professionals, we're always kind of under the gun to deal with the thing that is the most important. I would just like API security to be a little higher on the list, I think.
I think it will get there one way or another. Usually because of the incidents that occur, which is unfortunate, but I think it'll get there.
True. True. I
All right.
hope everybody had a good time. I certainly did.
Yeah. Thank you, and thanks everyone for attending.